So this week, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Philip Owens from the Department of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Northern British Columbia, who will be speaking on the accumulation and release of contaminants in glacial environments. Philip Owens is a professor and FRBC Endowed Research Chair in Landscape Ecology in the Department of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Northern British Columbia. His main research interest is how landscapes and watersheds respond to climate changes and human disturbances. In addition to his interest in glacial environments, much of his recent work has been on the hydrological and geomorphological effects of wildfires and the environmental impacts of the 2014 Mount Holly disaster, which at the time was the largest mine spill in the world. Please join me in welcoming today Dr. Owens.
Okay, great. Well, I'm just going to then roll on. So, yep, the title is in front of you, Accumulation and Release of Contaminants in Glacial Environments. So, in terms of some sort of context, I always think it's important to understand why we're interested in something like this. And if you see this image here, you can see that what we're looking at is the variation in air temperature, surface temperature over a period of about 1880 to 2020 based on data from NASA. And not surprisingly, if we take some sort of average period as some sort of reference, and you can see that's the middle period of this graph here, and then you look at how it's deviated from that over this time period, you can see that there's a very obvious increase in global surface air temperatures, and that it's increased by about sort of 0.89% over that time period. So we're in a time of warming climate that surprises nobody. And if we look at the distribution of those changes in surface air temperatures, it's not uniformly distributed across the planet. There are parts of the world that are getting a little warmer, and then there are some parts that are clearly getting a lot warmer. But the message that typically is that everywhere, bar a few exceptions, the planet is getting warmer everywhere. And if we see from this image here, the areas that are likely that are getting warmer relative to this reference period of the 1950s to the 1980s is pretty much the polar regions. So the North Pole and the South Pole, and particularly the northern part of the Northern Hemisphere, as you can see here. They're the areas with the redder colors. So clearly areas to the very north of our planet are experiencing the greatest temperature increases, and the forecast is that that will only get worse in the near future. If we look at the distribution of glaciers throughout the world, and here's a map based on a glacier inventory called the Randolph Global Glacier Inventory, we see that the areas in red are where we have active glaciers on the planet at the moment. So you can see obviously parts of the world that you're probably familiar having glacial environments. Obviously, we see parts of Western Canada, Alaska. We see parts of South America, Chile, Argentina, places like that that run along the North American and South American Cordillera. We see the higher mountains of Asia, the Himalaya, for example. And then obviously we see Arctic Canada, we see Greenland, Scandinavia, parts of Russia. And then there's also a few in other parts of the Southern Hemisphere, outside of the South America, such as New Zealand. There's a few in obviously Australia and Antarctica. And relative to the previous image that I just showed you, which was changing air surface temperatures over the last 130 years or so, and the distribution of the glaciers here, hopefully you can see that there's a coincidence in the location of those two things. So in other words, glacial environments are also often parts of the world that are seeing the greatest increase in surface air temperatures. And obviously it's not difficult to make the connection about what that means. So what we're seeing, not surprisingly, is we're seeing a retreat of glaciers in these environments as a function of the warming surface temperatures that's associated with climate change. So here we see an image that shows glacial recession globally over a fairly short window, so just 2000 to 23, so it's the last 23 years. And what we're seeing is cumulative change expressed both as tons and also as a change in what is called water equivalence. So that's the amount of water that is locked up in glaciers, apologies, that is actually being also released at the same time. And if you look at that, you can see that we are looking at a downward trajectory in terms of there's massive changes in both mass loss and water equivalent over that period of time. Now, this is just a global average. So if we hone into specific regions, and this represents different glacial regions of the planet, so very similar to the regions that I just showed you of that sort of global map a few minutes ago. This is some recent work that's come out by a global initiative that was published in Nature. And you can see that in all parts of the world, we typically see the same sort of trend. Now, the magnitude of that trend varies from one region to another, but typically they're all, basically glaciers are retreating. We're losing that sort of volume, and we're also releasing water into the downstream environment. And it may be difficult for you to see. I can't see what resolution you can see this at, but for the top line, they're the ones typically associated with Alaska, Western Canada, and the Arctic Canada. So they're the top line are the ones sort of more relevant to us. And we're seeing that downward trajectory because we're looking at glacial recession over the last 23 years. If we sort of hone in a little bit more to the Canadian situation, this is an assessment by what's called the Canada Mountain Assessment Program of what's going on in the mountain environments of Canada. And this is a map just showing you the distribution of mountainous environments. Not surprisingly, they're heavily skewed towards the western part of the country. So that'll be obviously Yukon, British Columbia, parts of Alberta, but there's also a lot along the western fringe as well, particularly as we go into the Arctic. So that's the distribution of mountainous landscapes in the country. And if we look at glaciers associated with those regions, and this is a table, again, it's based on what's called this Randolph Glacier Inventory. We see the different regions listed on the left-hand side. We see the amount of glaciers in terms of numbers, in surface areas, in elevation. And if we look at the very far right of this table, again, we are seeing that in Canada, we're seeing really significant mass changes, in this case expressed as meters, so a depth water equivalent per year. So a negative value suggests that obviously, well, it's showing, not suggesting, it's showing that glaciers are retreating throughout the whole of Canada. And if we look at that in a sort of a visual way in terms of a map, here we can see the glacier mass change expressed over the last sort of 20 years. So you can see that in areas where we have the oranges and the reds, that's where we're losing glaciers. And one of my colleagues who was involved with some of these maps that we're seeing, a guy called Brian Menounos, a few years ago, he's probably one of the leading glacial scientists in the country, actually. Somebody asked him what's going to happen by the end of the century, and he pretty much said that pretty much most glaciers in Canada will be gone by the end of the century, which is pretty depressing news. So sorry about that, but it's context for this particular lecture that I'm giving today. And the worrying thing is that, linked to that is like with the rest of the world, we're seeing a changing climate. So here we're seeing forecasts of temperature change and precipitation change for a variety of different global climate scenarios, because there can be a worse situation and there can be a best situation, and there can be some sort of, well, we're going to do a lot of good things, but we're probably not going to halt global climate change. So that's sort of a more middle scenario. But as you can see with all of these scenarios, temperatures are going to get warmer over the next 70 or so years. It just depends how good we are at curtailing that as to the magnitude of what that temperature change is likely to be. And we also see that to some degree with precipitation, but precipitation is much more variable. Some places in the country will get more precipitation. some will get less, and some will see a shift in the timing of that precipitation, so different parts of the year. And sometimes it will shift how we receive that precipitation. So sometimes we might get more rainfall, for example, compared to snow. If we sort of step back a little bit and think about what some of the contexts are and what some of the implications are for contaminants, this is a sort of a cartoon that just shows that because of the fact that we're in a very modified planet, some would argue we're in an Anthropocene period or epoch, there's lots of disturbances on the landscape, and many of those introduce substances which we can class as contaminants. So some of them are gaseous, some of them are associated with water, some are associated with particulates. But around glacial environments, lots of those could, through a variety of different atmospheric pathways, find their way to glacial environments. Because of the fact that most glaciers are in high elevation areas, it's typically atmospheric processes that are the ones that bring those contaminants to these regions. So here you can just see through this cartoon a variety of different land use activities that you might expect to see on parts of the planet. Some will be near glacial environments, some will actually be quite distal. And in many cases, a lot of them release contaminants in an atmospheric way that find their way through a variety of different pathways to these glacial environments that we've been looking at for the last sort of 10 minutes or so. And if we think about what contaminants could find their way to glacial environments, the list is actually quite long. Not all of these contaminants are necessarily derived from anthropogenic activities. Some of them are quite natural. We get certain types of metals, for example, that get released when we have a volcanic eruption. And if it's a big one, some of that material through atmospheric transfer pathways could make their way to glacial environments. Some of them are sort of those sort of, well, they are potentially human driven, but they're also natural, like wildfires. So we're seeing an increase in wildfires at the moment. But obviously that wildfire is also natural. And then there's a variety of other ones that are clearly a function of activities that we're doing on the landscape. And with a rising population of 8 billion or so that we're at the moment, then typically we're seeing an increase in these sort of resource activities in order to supply things for the population. And equally, we see things like increases in agricultural productivity. That often gets associated with wind erosion. When we see wind erosion, there's an opportunity there for particulates, eroded soil, to be lifted up into the atmosphere and then moved with atmospheric circulation patterns. And then there's a bunch of other things which are a little bit newer. So things like fallout radionuclides as a function of the atom bomb tests and sometimes nuclear disasters. We see other things like microplastics that we're hearing a lot about. So you can see a range of different types of contaminants. And some of those are going to be near glacial environments, some will be distant, and some get moved to those environments through a variety of different transport pathways. But typically the ones we're most interested in are these atmospheric ones. To bring home this idea that there are different sort of both distal and near sources of contaminants, and some of these affect glaciers in certain regions of the planet, some affect glaciers in other parts of the planet, and at different times. I'm going to show you a couple of illustrations to just show that sometimes some of these potential sources of contaminants can be quite local or regional. So this is a map of the smoke associated with some wildfires in North America in 2021. 2021 was a pretty bad year for North America in terms of wildfires. You're probably familiar with the fact that wildfires in the country, and certainly North America and other parts of the world, are increasing. For North America, particularly Canada, sort of 2017 seems to be a sort of a point whereby suddenly we started to see a lot more wildfires, and that is continued over the years, with 2023 being the worst wildfire season on record for Canada. But what hopefully you're picking up here is you can probably identify through the darker colors, the darker browns, the location of fires, but you can also see the distribution of the smoke from those fires. And it can spread over a really, significant area. So, in 2023, some of those fires that occurred in British Columbia, for example, around the Kamloops, Kelowna area that some of you may be familiar with, some of that smoke actually made all its way over to the eastern seaboard of the US. Okay, but as you can see there, not every part of Canada was affected necessarily by the smoke. Okay, so it can be a local, regional thing. It's not necessarily a global phenomena. And another example of how some contaminants that are sort of released into the atmosphere can affect a region specifically, as opposed to, say, the planet globally, is the Chernobyl fallout, or the Chernobyl nuclear incident that occurred in 1986 in Ukraine. So many of you are probably familiar. It was a catastrophic nuclear accident that occurred in Ukraine, and it released into the atmosphere a variety of different fallout radionuclides. Well, I should say radionuclide products such as cesium, plutonium, and a variety of other things. This is a diagram, or a map, I should say, really, that shows the distribution of the fallout of those radionuclide products that were released into the atmosphere in soils. So in the middle of this image, you may be able to pick out a red dot. The red dot is the location of the Chernobyl nuclear facility. And then the different colors represent the different levels of contamination of soils as a function of that accident. So when you see the brighter colors, that's where we see more contamination of soils with these fallout radionuclide products. And a couple of things to sort of note from this image here is, one, the distribution is not uniform. Okay, so there were areas close to the nuclear plant that have really high levels of contamination in soils of fallout radionuclides. And there were also distal areas that equally had the same sort of concentrations. And in the same way, there were areas really near the nuclear plant that actually almost had no record of fallout products in their soils. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is it's a function of the prevailing air patterns at the time of the incident or soon after the incident that moved the plume of radioactive products that were a function of Chernobyl into different parts of Europe. And then the other thing is, with fallout radionuclides, in terms of their signal in soils and sediments, you need a mechanism for that material to get back down to Earth. It's in the atmosphere and it would stay in the atmosphere typically, but the mechanism that brings it back down to Earth is typically precipitation. So where you see a lot of areas of high precipitation, in particular rainfall, the rain scavenges these products in the atmosphere and then it brings them back down to Earth and it labels the soils. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. So the idea that you get a varied distribution as a function of the prevailing wind patterns and also the mechanism to bring it back down to Earth, which is precipitation. So clearly in this case, not all parts of Europe had precipitation at the same time when this plume of material was moving around. So some areas received a lot of contamination and other parts did not. And the reason that we have differences in how atmospheric pollutants move around the planet and may therefore label soils and get incorporated into glaciers is a function of a couple of things. And one is there are these atmospheric layers that mean that sometimes if you have an event occurring, and if you look at the plot on the far left, if you have an event such that it only releases contaminants into the troposphere has a bit of a boundary on the top of it. It's called the tropopause. It's a sort of it's caused by differences in sort of temperatures. You often get some sort of boundary effect. The material that gets released because of anthropogenic activities that may just stay in the troposphere typically will only move short distances. It will affect regions locally or perhaps at a sort of continental scale. If you have contamination that gets into the stratosphere, then that material typically circulates everywhere around the globe. So, for example, in the 1950s and the 1960s, there were a series of atom bomb tests. You probably saw the film Oppenheimer, so you might be familiar with the sort of thing that happened. But as different countries in the world were trying to sort of move towards the arm race and develop nuclear atom bomb capacity, they were doing all these above ground atom bomb tests. And because they were above ground and they were so extreme, a lot of that radioactive product made its way into the stratosphere. And as I said, once things get into the stratosphere, then they can actually move around the planet globally. So that in the case of the fallout, in the case of the radionuclides that were a function of the atom bomb tests, they can be measured in every part of the planet. Whereas in the case of Chernobyl, because it only got into the troposphere, that radioactive material was more local. It was European and parts of Asia. We didn't detect any really significant Chernobyl fallout in North America, for example. And then the other thing, which is shown on the sort of right side of this plot here, is the fact that we have these prevailing wind and atmospheric currents that preferentially move parcels of air around the globe. And in the case of the Arctic and parts of North America, we see the pattern that's illustrated here. And what it means is that a lot of atmospheric material that might have a source, for example, in the eastern seaboard of the United States, or it might be in Europe or parts of Asia, preferentially moves northwards with these prevailing air currents. So it then rains out onto the Arctic and glacial environments in the north. But the source of the material is actually from, thousands of kilometers away in places like the US, for example. So we have this sort of layering of the atmosphere and global circulation, which means that it can move material around the planet in different ways. And then because of the fact that there's a range of anthropogenic activities, which are associated with things like wind erosion that sort of lifts soil material into the atmosphere. We see burning, we see these nuclear accidents, we see other accidents that release things into the atmosphere. We have quite a lot of contaminants in the atmosphere. And if we have precipitation, we have a mechanism to bring that back down to the earth. And in the case of the cryosphere, which is the sort of ice frozen part of the planet, it can have some pretty profound effects. So, we typically think of glacial environments of having this sort of lovely, clean ice. But now we're recognizing that because of all these contaminants, often it's black carbon, it's soot because of wildfires, glacial landscapes now are looking very different than they used to be in the past. So this is a photograph taken by a UNBC PhD student, Ben Pelto, some glacial environments in British Columbia. And as you can see, this is really dirty. The ice here, the glacial ice, is covered in basically soot and particulates. And if you sort of follow the logic of what we've been sort of talking about for the last 25 minutes, you can imagine a lot of that material. It isn't just particulates, it has contaminants on it as well. And there's a variety of different problems with that. We'll talk about the contaminant issue in a few minutes, but also just from a physical perspective, when you have these sort of dark colored soot and particulates landing on glacial surfaces, they absorb more incoming solar radiation. It's an effect often known as albedo. So you have a white surface, very reflective. If you have a dark surface, it absorbs incoming shortwave solar radiation. So in this case, because of all the dark particulates on the surface of a glacier, it's absorbing incoming solar radiation. It therefore provides an additional mechanism to melt the glacial ice. So this is why we see this positive feedback mechanism associated with climate change. And here, just from a purely physical perspective, we have another mechanism because of climate change to further increase glacial melt. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that we've done on a glacier in British Columbia, where we've looked at the impact of this in terms of what it means for some of the contaminants that have been deposited on the glacial surface. And it's a glacial environment called the Castle Creek Glacier. It's just to the west of Jasper. So if you were driving from Jasper to Prince George, it's roughly sort of between those two locations. And we were interested in this environment for a variety of reasons. One was to just understand how the proglacial environment, so that's the area in front of the glacier, is behaving with this retreating glacier. So hopefully you can pick out where the glacier is located. Obviously, it's the white stuff at the back. But if you can see there's a bunch of tents at the bottom of the photograph here, that's where the glacier used to be, 50, 60 years ago. But we've got basically a retreating glacial system, and you may be able to pick out some of those sort of ridges on the glacial foreland. They're markers that just represent how the glacier is retreated over time, with each ridge representing what was the advancement and then retreat on an annual basis. And then you can see that there's a river that's coming out of the glacial snout, and it's flowing down past our tents. And in this case, it flows into the Fraser River, which is the largest river system in British Columbia. It's about 230,000 square kilometers. And that river comes out of the Rocky Mountains near Mount Robson, flows past Prince George, and then it goes southwards and joins the Pacific Ocean in Vancouver. And we collected a variety of different materials, glacial material, so the material on top of the glacier called superglacial sediment, a lot of the sort of talus material on the slopes, moraine material, channel banks, and river sediment. And you can see hopefully a diagram at the bottom, or a photo, I should say, of a student doing some field work a few summers ago. And one of the samples of material that we collected is a thing called craconite. And what that is it's a type of sediment that you find on the surface of a glacier. So the sediment we find on top of a glacier surface is called superglacial material. And craconite is a sort of specific type of that. It tends to be a combination of fallout of dust and other particulates. And then because of the fact that it absorbs that incoming solar radiation, it causes these little holes. And then within the holes, you get this particulate material. You've got a little bit of water, and then you actually have a little microcosm of activity. And then suddenly you find you've got fungi and algae and bacteria growing. So there are these little sort of regions where you've got contaminated sediment and a lot of biological activity going on. And here you can just see a couple of photographs of this sort of material. So we collected this material, which is called craconite, and we measured it for a variety of different things, not expecting necessarily to find out how contaminated it was. But when we subjected the samples for radionuclide analysis, we were really surprised to find that it was really very high in a variety of different fallout radionuclide products. And these are the products associated typically with the atom bomb tests in the 1950s and 60s that clearly occurred a long way from where these glaciers are located. So one of them is cesium-137. You can see that on the plot on the left-hand side. And what we have here, the bars represent different types of material. So that sort of proglacial material, I was able to get some subglacial material. It was a bit scary. I was able to sort of walk into one of the tunnels that was coming out of the glacier at the snout. I also got some material from the surface of the glacier, this craconite, and then other local channel bank material. And as you can see, the values associated with this glacial material, the craconite, are orders of magnitude greater than anything else. And we were a little bit surprised by that, I have to admit. We weren't anticipating to find the material so contaminated. And to put that into some sort of context, with these radionuclides, they're way higher than anything else we typically find on the planet, like soils and material we get from lakes and wetlands. The only places on the planet that have values higher than this are around things like Chernobyl or Fukushima, which was the nuclear power plant that experienced an issue in Japan when there was a tsunami sort of a decade or so ago. So these levels are really quite concerning, recognizing that these are radioactive products, which are not great. You wouldn't want to be eating this radionuclide, uh, enriched sediment, for example. So with a team of other people, we've started to look at how contaminated these glacial sediments are. And we've assembled a sort of a global inventory of these fallout radionuclides. And here you can see a map of, again, these three different fallout radionuclides: americium 241, unsupported lead 210, and cesium 137. And they're derived from both natural products, but also from these sort of anthropogenic activities like the atom bomb tests and Chernobyl and Fukushima. And the sides of the dots and the colors represent the different levels of contamination of these fallout radionuclides in this glacial material. And you can see, obviously, the samples collected from British Columbia there. There's also obviously lots of samples from South America. There's some from Antarctica. We've got mountains in Asia. A lot of work's gone on because the prime team are from Europe. So we see the Italian Alps. We see Scandinavia. There's the Faroe Islands. There's Iceland, Greenland. And there's a fairly consistent pattern of fairly high concentrations of fallout radionuclides across all of these glacial environments. It's not just British Columbia. We're pretty much seeing it everywhere, with more contamination in the northern hemisphere, probably in the southern hemisphere. And one of the reasons for this is, although I talked about the fact that if you have fallout radionuclides or other contaminants released into the stratosphere, they tend to move around the whole planet. The two hemispheres are slightly disconnected in terms of their atmospheric circulation patterns. So although they are connected and things in the northern hemisphere get into the southern hemisphere, because most of the atom bomb tests with the northern hemisphere, they typically are associated more with the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere. So, we get contamination of all of these fallout radionuclides in the southern hemisphere, but it's a lot higher typically in the northern hemisphere. And I've done some work on, these fallout radionuclides in soils in different parts of the world, and we see that same pattern. We see more in Canada and Europe and North America generally than we might see in, for example, South America, or I've done some work in Africa and Australia and New Zealand. And that seems to also be borne out here with these fallout radionuclides. But the difference here is these values are way, way higher than anything I've ever measured before in soils. And probably Alex, who's also done some similar work, would probably testify as well to that sort of situation. And it's other more worrying nuclides as well as perhaps some of the ones I've just alluded to. So we're now starting to look at things like plutonium. And again, we see that in the northern hemisphere, more than the southern hemisphere, really high levels of things like plutonium. And all of these things are not great for, humans or, terrestrial aquatic ecosystems. So, bear that in mind when you look at these sort of patterns and numbers. They're pretty concerning, given the fact that, nobody would walk into the Chernobyl nuclear exclusion zone, and yet we're seeing concentrations that are, not radically different than what we find in those sorts of environments. And it's not just radionuclides that we're now finding in this sort of glacial sediment, this cryoconite. Here we see some different heavy metals, or I should say metals and a nutrient. So we see on the far left, we see mercury, P for phosphorus, Pb for lead, and then we see tungsten. And again, if you sort of pick out that sort of brown color bar, which represents the cryoconite, you can see that the levels of these trace elements are really high in the cryoconite relative to anything else. And one of the reasons we think that's the case is because these sediments are acting like a sponge. Because of the fact that there's lots of biological activity associated with the sediments, and sediments themselves are a really good sponge for contaminants. With all the glacial meltwater now running off the glacier, we're finding that those sediments are just acting like a super sponge, absorbing any contaminant that's in the glacial meltwater. So it's getting super enriched in these fallout radionuclides. It's getting enriched in heavy metals. And in this case, we see a nutrient as well, phosphorus. And if we think about, well, okay, so we're seeing a lot of release of these contaminants that are being stored in the glacier, both in the meltwater and the sediment. And then when the glacial ice melts and releases water, that the sediments are basically on the surface of the glacier are absorbing it. What does that mean for the sort of downstream environment? So we collected some sediment samples from the river channel at 3 different locations, going away from the snout of this Castle Creek Glacier. And you can see, hopefully, arrows indicating roughly where we collected our sediment samples. And they're called, in this case, we've just called them proximal, middle, and distal, with the idea that the distal one is about 1 kilometer or so away from the glacial snout. And hopefully you can see with the concentrations of these 3 radionuclides that I've been talking about for the last 5 minutes or so, the concentrations are getting less the further we go away from the glacial snout. The other thing is these concentrations are not nearly as high as what we see on the glacial sediment samples I showed earlier, but these are still pretty significant, particularly the ones collected really close to the glacial snout. And then what happens is that the further you go away from the glacier, other sources of sediment like eroding channel banks and perhaps some of the hill slope material, the talus, contributes what is moderately clean sediment to the river channel, so that that signal from the glacier actually dilutes the further we go away. But we're definitely picking up a signal in that, so that certainly that proximal sediment sample is collected near the glacial snout. And it's not just fallout radionuclides, and it's not just heavy metals that I've illustrated. We see other studies picking out other contaminants. So here, for example, we see what's called persistent organic pollutants. These are typically associated with human activities. And at the bottom, you can see a list of what some of those are. PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, for example, and we see a variety of other ones. DDT is something you may have heard about. It was associated with the application of pesticides and herbicides in the agricultural environment. They're now banned, DDTs, but we're still seeing those sort of legacy effects, because what happened is they got transported with atmospheric pathways, deposited in glacial environments in the 1950s and 1960s. They then got banned, but we're seeing them now being released into the sort of downstream environment because of the retreating glaciers with climate change. So we see 3 different glacial environments here in the Italian Alps, and these are water samples collected from the meltwaters. And we're seeing both these contemporary and legacy persistent organic contaminants being detected in these sort of glacial meltwater systems. And also we see it in other parts of the world, like here we see glaciers coming off of the Himalaya in India. This is the Ganges river system, for example. And again, different types of contaminants. So if you look at the middle one, we see those PCBs again. And the graph shows concentrations of these different contaminants as we go away from the glacial snout. And in some cases, we're going sort of well over 1,000 kilometers away. And although the concentrations are going up the further you go away from the glacial snout, that's not surprising, because the Ganges is going through agricultural zones, it's going through industrial and urban populations. You would expect the concentrations to go up as the Ganges moves through these other anthropogenic activities and land use, but clearly really close to the glacial snout, within kilometers, some really significant concentrations. Almost, if you pick the PCBs, for example, it's almost 1/3 to 1/2 of what you might expect 1,000 kilometers away by the time it's gone through, zones of, millions of people and high agricultural areas and lots of industrial activity. And now we're seeing, other more topic typical contaminants being recorded in these. So microplastics, for example. Microplastics, they're very fine, they have a very low density, so they're easily moved with atmospheric processes. A lot of them are finding their way to glacial environments. So, we're detecting microplastics in the Arctic, in glacial environments, clearly a long way from their source. And obviously, there's a lot of literature about them being incorporated into the global oceans. So not surprisingly, because of these retreating glaciers, we're picking up microplastics in this superglacial sediment, and also there are studies that are showing it in downstream receiving waters. So this is actually microplastics in superglacial sediment. I don't know if this is cryoconite per se, but it's very similar type of material. The authors called it superglacial. So it's material on the surface of the glacier, in this case in Italy. In terms of what this means for the off-site impacts with the release of all these contaminants that have previously been locked up and stored in glaciers, we don't really know, because we're just beginning to understand that actually glacial environments have been storing all these contaminants for years, decades, perhaps, maybe 100 or so years in areas perhaps close to where the Industrial Revolution occurred. We don't know what the implications are for the downstream impacts, but we pretty much know that there will be some, because obviously there are this cocktail of material being released into meltwaters that go down obviously through communities. They pass through lakes, wetlands, where there are going to be aquatic organisms. There's terrestrial organisms that clearly are going to be eating things like lichen and that you might find. So we're pretty much expecting, and if you just look at, for example, the bottom three circles and comments there, that we're pretty much expecting that they're going to get incorporated into vegetation that's growing in the proglacial zone, and we're pretty certain it's going to start to get incorporated into the food chain. We saw an element of this when there was the Chernobyl accident, for example. So a lot of reindeer in Scandinavia, for example, that typically received a lot of fallout radionuclide, given the mountainous landscape and precipitation there, they started to accumulate fallout radionuclides as a function of the Chernobyl incident. So we would fully expect that these downstream environments from glaciers globally are going to start to sort of, those contaminants are going to get into the food web. And also, of course, there are lots of communities downstream of glacial environments. In Canada, less so, but certainly if you go to Europe, there are large populations very close to glaciers that actually draw their water source from those melting glaciers. So there's obviously some concerns about what that might mean for water quality and drinking water supply in these sort of environments close to glacial areas. So that's it, because I was asked to leave a few minutes for questions, but just to say that there's a video and an online article which is a sort of a nice summary of what I've talked about here, which I contributed to, but also some other people. And there's a link to a sort of a 7-minute video and a sort of an online report that describes what I've been talking about here, primarily in the context of fallout radionuclides. But obviously the implications are that we now know there's lots of other contaminants as well, like microplastics and metals. And unfortunately, there's also some early studies showing that there's the high chance that there'll be pathogens and viruses released. And weirdly enough, and we don't need to go too far, but there was a paper that was produced a few years ago that actually made a connection between COVID-19 and thawing permafrost in Siberia as the possible source. But I'm not convinced that's quite true. But it is a bellwether of the fact that we do need to be very mindful with a melting cryosphere that we may see contaminants in downstream environments. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Owens. That was so interesting. So now we're going to open the floor for questions.
We can also take questions online. They can type their question in, or they can just turn the microphone on.
So in one of your earlier slides, you showed various areas that had higher differences in temperature relative to several decades ago, in particular areas that do have a lot of glaciers. Is the fact that these glaciers are generally like pretty low albedo, but with the contaminants now have a significantly higher albedo, one of the reasons that they seem to be so severely impacted by climate change relative to other areas?
Yeah, I think it's a sort of a double whammy really, which means that unfortunately all these sort of cryospheric environments, and I'm linking here Arctic sea ice, glaciers, permafrost. Many of them occur in parts of the world that are experiencing the greatest temperature change. So the north and half of North America is getting hotter, warmer than most other parts of the planet. So that's a problem. So given the fact that obviously most of these cryospheric environments are to the north, then they're also those that are experiencing the greatest temperature increase. And then because of the fact that these areas are also getting this dark material being deposited on them, because of the fact that we're seeing more soot, black carbon, and other things released into the atmosphere with industrial activities. And then we're seeing increased wildfires as well, particularly in obviously, North America. Then that soot landing on glaciers and the change of the albedo is providing another mechanism for this rapid retreat in glacial ice and melting permafrost that we're seeing.
Okay, thank you.
I was just wondering if you could kind of speak to the properties of that cryoconite and sort of explain why it acts as a sponge in holding those contaminants compared to the supraglacial sediment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And that's a good question. And it enables me to sort of speak about something I probably didn't talk a huge amount. So the boundary between what is, say, supraglacial sediment and cryoconite is a blurry one. I mean, they're both types of sediment found on the surface of glaciers. With the cryoconite in particular, which is a type of this surface glacial sediment, because of that high sort of dark color, it tends to make these little holes because it's absorbing the incoming solar radiation. And because of the fact that we have a hole, you also get a little bit of water coming in as well as finding the sediment. So that material starts to become essentially a little microcosm of activity. So it isn't just mineralogic material. We find that there's algae and other biological products. There's extracellular polymeric substances. There's a range of different organisms, microorganisms, algae, fungi that are also associated with that sediment because now there's there's a little bit of melting water. There's some sort of probably some nutrients associated with that sediment. Even the mineralogic sediment would often have some nutrients on it. Sometimes there's a little bit of carbon. So it's a little living environment, basically. And because of that, lots of chemicals tend to bind onto things like organic matter. They tend to bind on to fine particles like silts and clays. So because a lot of this cryoconite is really fine, because it has a really quite high carbon content and it has this sort of suite of organisms living within it, they basically act as sponge. So because of that, it just tends to absorb a lot of the contaminants that are both associated with the sediment itself, but also with all this sort of flowing water that contains maybe dissolved contaminants. As soon as it hits this cryoconite, it just basically gobbles up the contaminants. And we see this in other environments as well. If you were to put sediment into a river, for example, that's got a lot of dissolved contaminants, they tend to absorb the contaminants as well on the sediment. So it's not purely cryoconite, but for some reason, cryoconite has got a variety of properties that we're just beginning to understand. That means it's even more of a sponge than many other types of material. And then, of course, it's got, so much flowing water going over it that's got, a century of contaminants locked up in it, then it acts as a super sponge.
Just a little follow-up quickly. So is that considered beneficial to downstream environments if there was like a higher ratio of the cryoconite? Or
That's
is it?
that's a good question, and I gave a talk once to a reporter on CBC Radio about this, and they asked a kind of similar question. And that's a good point. I mean, there are some advantages in that material is locking up all of these contaminants that may otherwise be released to the downstream environment. And you could argue that perhaps you could go and harvest that material. You could collect it and therefore take it away and deal with it in a more efficient way so it doesn't sort of get released to the downstream environment. Because one of the problems is that cryoconite is being, released, even though it might sit on the glacial surface, glaciers are going back, so that sediment gets dumped into downstream environments. So there are maybe some positive things in that it is acting as a sponge. And, I guess we could take some of the understanding of those processes and we could actually, perhaps in a glacial environment, add some sort of material that could also act as a sponge in the same way that the cryoconite is, in that, if there's a lot of contaminants locked up in these glacial ice now being released, as water, maybe we could get that water to pass through some sort of filter system that's acting in the same way that cryoconite does. So it could gobble up all those contaminants that are both, solutional and also, particulate.
Thank you very much.
There's a question online that's kind of related. So Holly asks, has any work been done on looking at the biological communities and comparing what we see in the superglacial sediments to what we're seeing in the kind of proglacial? So my guess is what is the biological community in the what are they called? Cryo? Yeah, anyway. Is it unique relative to the surrounding area?
Yeah, that's a good question. And just to follow up on your stumble, I don't like the word cryoconite. It's something I struggle with, but it's a term that's out there. So, I don't want to invent a new term so that everybody's using the same word, but it's not a really nice word to be able to use. Cryoconite, it sounds horrible. And people say it differently. I'm not a biologist, so I'm happy to step back and say I don't really know, but I do know that a lot of scientists are now beginning to get really interested in what is the biological composition, what are the microbes present in this particular, sort of fairly unique glacial environment that is these cryoconite holes. So I know there's a whole bunch of studies that are now coming out, looking at, what's in there and what can it sort of tell us about, these really sort of unique extreme environments. The same way we find really unusual, microbial compositions in, hot springs and things like that. So, but I don't know, but I know there's a bunch of papers that have talked about the microbial composition of this cryoconite. It certainly does play a role in why it scavenges so effectively. So thank you, Holly.
So I have a question. The glacier that you're working on, do you have an estimate of how long it's going to last?
Oh, that's a really good, that's an interesting observation as well. I don't know for this particular glacier, but I know that, for example, some of the people that were associated with some of these sort of big picture glacial mapping exercises that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, one being my colleague at UNBC, Brian Menounos, who at the moment is seconded by the Geological Survey of Canada to head their glacial branch to try and look at these sorts of things. He's pretty much projected that if you run a climate model linked to a glacier mass balance model, and they've done it for pretty much every glacial environment on the planet, they will pretty much mainly be gone by the end of the century. So he's done it, for example, he published, there was a paper in Nature that he was involved with some colleagues, Gary Clark at UBC, and they modeled it for all of the glaciers in North America, so Alaska down through Yukon, BC, into the United States below the border. And every glacier environment was going to decrease quite dramatically. It depends on the climate scenario, depending on if you go with a sort of worst case, best case, or moderate situation. If you go with the worst case, the glaciers pretty much go by about 95% or so by the end of the century. If you go with the best case, it might be something like 50%, and then some sort of realistic carbon dioxide greenhouse gas scenario puts it at sort of somewhere between those two. But it's pretty depressing. And unfortunately, from some of the recent global inventories that we've seen and modeling stuff we've seen in sort of big journals like Nature and Science, it seems to be that that's occurring throughout the planet. So thanks, Gord.
So we're suffering net loss here every year on these glaciers. So we have dirty water coming into the river systems, dirty sort of, and so we're looking in the future at dirty water and less water in our river systems that are fed by glaciers.
Yeah, that's correct. So a lot of people have looked at things like water flow, water temperature downstream of glacial environments. And at the moment, some parts of the world are seeing a excess pulse of water because we're looking at glacial environments. But there's lots of parts of the planet whereby we are on a bit of a tail end of that. So actually, river levels are starting to sort of decrease often because the glaciers are getting so small now that they're not basically replenishing these headwater systems with the water and the cold water that they've experienced. So one of the additional effects of these melting glaciers, in addition to changing the timing of water flows, which we rely on. So the Himalayas, for example, most people get their drinking water supply from the Himalayas. Another one is the fact that you're going to see a change in water temperature, which if you're looking at freshwater fish, like salmonids and that, it's a big concern. Certainly in BC, people are getting very anxious because, typically there's a pulse of cold water that comes at the end of the summer, which you naturally get because of obviously warmer temperatures in the summer. They provide cold water to a lot of these headwater streams, which is where the salmonids typically spawn. If you take away that sort of cold water replenishing these headwater streams, then they're going to increase temperatures quite dramatically. And with lots of salmonids, salmon, for example, if you get above 17, 20 degrees C surface water temperature, that becomes detrimental. So it's a bit of a sad story. I apologize for a Friday, but there's so many problematic effects of these melting glaciers, not just losing something that's so wonderful aesthetically, but also there's lots of environmental impacts of it.
Okay, thanks.
Well, that's a quick one. Does your group actually physically collect and analyze its own samples?
We do for certain contaminants. So UNBC has got analytical labs like at Brandon. But weirdly, and there's a nice connection here, for our fallout radionuclides, we'd send them to the University of Manitoba. So as Alex would know, University of Manitoba, there's a professor there, David Lobb. He has some fallout radionuclide gamma detectors. So I actually send often my samples to Manitoba for the fallout radionuclides. There's a few other labs around the world that I collaborate with. There's some in the UK and there's other parts of the world, but typically I send my samples to Manitoba.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, which environments do you think will be most affected by these glacial contaminants?
That's provocative question. I think in some respects, regions that are close to highly industrial and populated areas are likely to have a higher contaminant burden than, say, glaciers that are far removed, because some contaminants circulate the planet globally, so every part of the planet gets them. Lots of others are going to be enriched with contaminants that are more local. So I'm sure that if we look at the Alps in Europe, given the fact that there's 450 million people in Europe, those glaciers are going to probably have higher levels of contaminants, particularly things like industrial products, plastics. So one can imagine that release of glacial meltwater and sediment is going to make areas downstream more contaminated. And then also, there's more people that rely on those water sources for drinking water, etc. Maybe in somewhere like British Columbia and Alberta and the Yukon, the problem might be for aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. I mean, we have lots of caribou, moose, bears that live in these environments. They eat the vegetation that's going to be growing there. Soils pick up these contaminants. They transfer it often to plants. Then you have animals like caribou eating them. So it may be that often in these sort of areas, it may be more the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems that are going to suffer. And in Europe and other parts of the world, particularly say the Himalaya, it might be more to do with human water resources that are a problem or of concern, because they don't have nearly as many wonderful animals. They've eaten them all. Don't quote me on that.
I think that is all the time we have for today, but thank you so much, Dr. Owens. That was
Thank you. It was fun. Appreciate it.
awesome. And I'd like to remind you, I'm going to read it one more time. Dr. Aisha Salim's talk next week will be on cell-specific effects of chronic contractile activity-induced extracellular vesicles on mitochondrial biogenesis and apoptosis. And I'll see you all next week. Thank you.
Yeah, that was impressive.
Yeah. Thanks again, Bill. Much appreciated.
Thanks. I appreciate the invitation.
Thanks to everyone online as well as in person for coming. Appreciate it.